All right, so let's dive into this question that just keeps coming up these days. Can we ever create truly unbiased AI?
Yeah, it's a big one. And it feels like the more we talk about AI, the more this question of bias comes up.
For sure. And I think that's why we wanted to do this deep dive today, because we've got two sources that I think are going to offer some really interesting perspectives on
Yeah, and
this.
they're pretty different sources too, right?
Yeah, one is like straight from the AI's mouth, so to speak. We've got a conversation with an AI called DeepSeek, and
Okay.
then we have some notes from a phone call where it was a group of people who were talking about, real world efforts to address AI ethics and advocacy.
So we've got the AI's perspective and the human's perspective.
Exactly, and I'm curious to see, how those two connect and what we can kind of tease out from comparing them.
Yeah, it's like we're getting both the theoretical and the practical side of things.
Totally. So let's start with DeepSeek because I think its take on this is fascinating.
Now, yeah, what does DeepSeek have to say?
Well, right off the bat, DeepSeek is like, hey, look, we learn from data,
All
right?
right,
So obviously, if the data that we're learning from is biased, well, guess what?
we're going to be
The AI is going to be biased too.
Yeah, that's pretty straightforward when you think about it.
Yeah, it's kind of like duh, but sometimes we need those dumb moments to really get to the heart of things.
Absolutely. And DeepSeek actually gave a really concrete example.
Oh, yeah.
Like, imagine training an AI on all the text on the internet.
Okay.
We know there's tons of bias just baked into that content, right? All those opinions and everything.
Oh, yeah.
So even if we don't want the AI to be biased, it can still pick up on those patterns and replicate them in its output.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like the AI doesn't know any better. It's just like, oh, this is how humans talk. This is how they think. This must be the right way.
Right. It's just absorbing everything it's given.
And then when DeepSeek talks about, types of bias, it mentions the usual suspects like gender bias and racial bias, but it also brings up this idea of cultural stereotypes.
Oh, interesting.
Like, how certain cultures might associate particular traits with certain professions and how that could lead to biased outcomes if the AI isn't carefully trained to recognize those nuances.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that angle, but it makes sense. Like our cultural backgrounds shape our perceptions in so many ways.
And it's not always like outright discrimination either. It's these subtle things that can creep in without us even realizing it.
It's the implicit bias that we're often not even aware of.
Exactly, and that makes it even harder to catch and correct.
And that kind of leads to the next point, right?
Yeah.
Even if you can pinpoint the sources of bias, removing it from the data is a whole different challenge.
Oh, yeah, that's where things get really tricky.
Because data is basically a snapshot of the real world. And the real world is, well, messy.
Yeah, it's not exactly a clean room experiment.
No, not at all. It's full of all these implicit biases and historical inequalities and so many things that are super hard to measure and filter out.
It's like you're trying to bake a cake, but all your ingredients have already been mixed together and you can't unmix them.
Right. Or like trying to take a photo of a sunset, but there's a bunch of power lines in the way, and you can't just Photoshop them out without making the whole image look weird.
Perfect analogy. And to complicate things even further, what we consider biased can change from culture to culture, even from person to person.
Yeah, totally. So it's like trying to find this universal standard for identifying and removing bias, and it's practically
So,
impossible.
like, everyone has their own lens they're looking through.
Exactly.
So, given all this, how does DeepSeek suggest we handle this from a technical standpoint?
Well, DeepSeek mentions a few approaches, like you could try to debias the data itself.
Okay.
You could use algorithms that are specifically designed to detect and reduce bias.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's always relying on human oversight.
Yeah, like having humans check the AI's work.
Exactly. But as you might guess, each method has its limitations.
Oh, I'm sure.
Like with cleaning data, you might accidentally remove important context or miss those subtle bits of bias.
Right, you could throw out the baby with the bathwater.
And then algorithms, as powerful as they are, they can introduce new biases of their own or misinterpret the data.
So it's like we're trying to fix one problem and we might create another one in the process.
Yeah, kind of. And then relying on humans, well, that could be really subjective and hard to do at a large scale,
Yeah.
especially with these massive data sets that AI uses.
So it seems like we're in a bit of a pickle here.
A bit.
We need to get rid of bias, but the very act of trying to do that can be well biased in itself.
Exactly. And that brings us to a concept that DeepSeek highlighted: fairness.
Okay.
How do you even define fairness when you're building an AI system?
Oh. Yeah, that's a tough one.
Should everyone be treated exactly the same, no matter their background? Or should the AI consider historical inequalities and try to even things out?
Those are some really big questions, and I don't think there are any easy answers.
Not at all. And this lack of a clear definition just makes the challenge of eliminating bias even more complex.
So, after laying out all these difficulties, is DeepSeek at least optimistic about the future of unbiased AI?
It actually strikes this cautiously optimistic tone.
Oh, okay.
It points out that all these advances in AI training and bias detection tools are giving us more options in this fight.
That's good.
But it also acknowledges that eliminating all bias might just be impossible.
Well, why is that?
Because as long as AI is learning from data created by humans,
Hmm.
and humans are inherently biased beings,
Right.
it's likely that some level of bias is always going to be there in these systems.
It's like baked into the recipe.
Yeah, DeepSeek's perspective was that instead of chasing this ideal of perfect, unbiased AI, we should focus on constant improvement.
Okay.
So mitigating the impact of bias wherever we can, and just accepting that this is a journey, not a destination.
More about managing bias than pretending we can erase it completely.
Exactly. And DeepSeek even mentions that regulation and standards could be helpful to push developers to prioritize debiasing.
Yeah, like having some guidelines in place.
Yeah, but getting everyone to agree on those standards, that's a huge undertaking, especially on a global level.
It's like herding cats.
Yeah, so it's a complex situation, but at least there's some hope that we can make progress.
Right, and that brings us to our second source, those notes from the phone call about AI ethics advocacy. It's so interesting to see how these real-world efforts connect to what DeepSeek was talking about.
Definitely, it's like we're seeing the theory in action.
Exactly. And one thing that jumped out at me from those notes was the emphasis on education and awareness.
Yeah, that seems crucial, right?
Like, people need to understand what AI bias is, how it can impact them, and what we can do to address it.
And that connects directly to what DeepSeek was saying about needing to be informed and proactive about this issue.
Totally. And what's even more encouraging is that the notes actually mention a list of actionable steps to reverse bias.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it emphasizes that individuals can actually make a difference, even if the problem seems huge.
I love that it's easy to feel overwhelmed by something like AI bias. So it's good to know that we all have a role to play.
Yeah, it's like instead of just sitting back and complaining about it, these notes are like, okay, here are some things you can actually do.
It's so empowering.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something I think we need more of in this conversation.
Definitely. But you know, it's interesting.
What's that?
The phone call notes also mention some very human moments, like people struggling with scheduling or having technical difficulties joining the call.
Wait, what do those things have to do with AI bias?
Well, that's precisely the point.
Okay.
These everyday struggles are actually examples of human biases and communication challenges that can influence how we develop and use AI.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection. Like, our own human flaws can impact the very systems we're creating.
Exactly. And the people on the call seemed really aware of this.
Hmm.
They emphasized the importance of plain language and information design to improve communication and understanding, not just between humans, but also when it comes to AI.
So just like clear communication helps us understand each other, a transparent and explainable AI is crucial for building trust and mitigating bias in those systems.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
all interconnected.
Wow, this is giving me a lot to think about. We've gone from an AI's perspective on bias to real-world efforts to combat it. And it's fascinating how closely those two things are linked.
That interconnectedness is a key theme for sure. And there's one point from the phone call notes that I think really brings this home. They were talking about how important it was for them to have like a really clear vision statement for their group.
Hmm, a vision statement. Why would that be so crucial when we're talking about something as complex as AI bias?
Well, think about it, like DeepSeek was saying, how tricky it is to define fairness, right?
Wow.
This group is running into that same wall, trying to articulate their goals and the impact they want to have.
Oh, I see.
So a vision statement, it's like a compass,
Hmm.
it guides their actions and their decisions.
Okay, so it's not just about doing something, it's about being really intentional about what they're working towards and how they're going to get there.
Exactly. It keeps them aligned and makes sure their efforts are all pushing in the same direction.
Right, makes sense. And speaking of efforts, I'm curious about that list of actionable steps to reverse bias that we mentioned earlier. What kinds of things are we talking about here?
Yeah, the notes don't go into specifics, but they really hammer home this idea of individual action.
Yeah, and I think that's so important because it's easy to feel like, what can I do? This is such a huge problem.
Right.
But those notes are like, no, 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 you can actually make a difference.
It's true. Even small actions can have a ripple effect.
Oh, yeah, like the butterfly effect, right?
Exactly. A tiny flap of a butterfly's wings can cause a hurricane across the world.
I love that analogy. It really speaks to that interconnectedness we keep talking about.
Yeah, and when it comes to AI bias, We can't afford to just sit back and watch. We have to be active participants in shaping a future where AI is ethical and responsible.
I'm feeling inspired. What else can we learn from these notes about how folks are tackling AI bias in the real world?
Well, one theme that kept popping up was using plain language and information design as tools.
Okay, I need you to connect the dots for me here. How do plain language and design play into addressing AI bias?
Well, think about it. If we as humans sometimes struggle to understand each other clearly,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
imagine how much harder it is to understand these complex AI systems and make sure they're being fair.
Right.
So plain language and thoughtful design, they can help bridge that gap
Okay.
by making these systems more transparent and accessible to everyone, not just the techies.
So it's not just about writing clear instructions for how to use the AI, it's about making the inner workings, the decision-making processes more understandable to the average person.
You got it. And that transparency is key for building trust and accountability.
Right. If people understand how the AI works, they're more likely to trust it and hold it accountable.
Exactly. And you mentioned something about mob mentality and online discussions earlier. What was that about?
Yeah, the notes talked about how mob mentality can be so damaging, especially online where things can get out of control so quickly.
It's true. It can derail productive conversations and shut down any dissenting voices.
Yeah, it's like everyone's just piling on.
But how does that relate to AI bias, you might ask?
I am asking.
It's a subtle connection, but it's there. Remember, AI learns from the data we feed it,
Right.
and that includes all the good, the bad, and the ugly stuff we see online.
Okay.
So if an AI is exposed to tons of toxic or biased language, it can learn those patterns and start using them in its output.
Oh, wow. So the negativity and bias we see online can actually fuel the very bias we're trying to eliminate from AI
It's
systems.
like this vicious cycle.
It really is. And this emphasizes the importance of having online spaces that encourage healthy debate and diverse opinions.
Absolutely.
Mm.
We need online environments that model the kind of behavior we want to see in AI systems.
It's like we need to teach AI not just the rules of grammar, but the rules of civil discourse.
Exactly. And that's where the human element comes in again.
Mm-hmm.
We're responsible for setting a good example, being aware of our own biases, and advocating for inclusivity and diversity in AI development.
It sounds like addressing AI bias isn't just about tweaking algorithms, it's about addressing the roots of bias in our society.
It's about shifting our mindset both individually and as a whole. And the phone call notes touched on another interesting point related to this.
Yeah.
It was about how they needed to improve their website content and, how they manage it.
To website content, that seems pretty specific. How does that fit into all this talk about AI bias?
It all comes back to making information easy to understand for everyone.
Right.
Like we were saying, how plain language can help demystify AI. Well, good website design can be a big help in educating people about AI bias.
Okay, so it's about making information accessible to more people.
Yeah, letting them know about the potential consequences and what they can do about it.
So it's like giving people the tools to be more informed and engaged citizens in this whole AI thing.
Exactly. And it's about creating a place where people can go to find resources and share best practices and learn from each other.
Like a central hub for all things AI bias.
Yeah, the more we can work together, the better equipped we'll be to handle these challenges.
Wow, this has been such an insightful deep dive. We've really explored AI bias from all these different angles, and I love how many connections we've found.
Me too. It's been really thought-provoking.
What's the biggest takeaway for you?
I think for me, it's that realization that AI bias isn't just a technical problem, it's a human problem.
Yeah.
The biases we see in these AI systems, they're a reflection of our own biases.
That's such a powerful insight, and it makes you realize that we can't just try to fix the AI. We have to address the root causes of bias in ourselves and our society.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual responsibility. It's about changing the systems that perpetuate bias.
Working towards a more just world for everyone.
Absolutely.
This conversation has been incredibly eye-opening, but I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
Yeah, there's always more to uncover.
Any other nuggets of wisdom we can glean from these sources?
Well, there's this one little detail from the phone call notes that I think is worth mentioning. They were trying to schedule a meeting with this guy named Tony.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's so special about scheduling a meeting?
It's not about the meeting itself, it's what it represents.
Okay.
Even when we're dealing with these huge, complex problems like AI bias, sometimes progress just boils down to human connection,
Yeah,
collaboration, and sometimes just getting everyone's calendars to line up.
it's the little thing.
It is, and it's humbling, right? We can get so caught up in the theory and the tech that we forget about the simple human stuff.
The importance of communication and empathy and just being willing to work together.
Exactly.
So for you, the listener, what does this all mean? What small steps can you take to promote responsible AI or raise awareness about bias in your own life?
Maybe it's talking to your friends about this, seeking out diverse perspectives, supporting organizations working on this issue.
Or just being more critical of the information you see online every little bit helps.
And don't underestimate the power of curiosity. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep pushing for better.
The future of AI is in our hands, and it's up to all of us to make sure it's a good one.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.